Welcome to part 2 of landscape design. In this video, we're going to go out and have a look at the garden I'm going to design in this course, and then I'll show you how to do a sketch plan. If you haven't watched the video called Landscape Design Part 1, I suggest you start there, because without some of that information, this one might not make a lot of sense to you. As part of the homework from last week, I asked you to go around your property, the garden you're going to design, and have a look at what's there, what you might want to change. Try to get a feel for some of the problems that you're going to have to correct with design. I want to do that with you now with my property. First, I'll go through the property and show you all the pictures, and then we'll come back, go through the set again. The second time, I'll do some critique. Standing at the front of the property, looking down the space between the house we're going to design for, the one on the left, and the neighbor. As you can see, there's very little space down here, and we're really not going to try to do too much. This is the opposite corner of the house. You can see that this is a corner lot, so there's a street in front of the house and one beside the house. Now the one beside the house is pretty noisy. It's a busy road. So we have to take that noise into consideration when we're doing the design. What can we do to reduce the noise? The focus in this program is going to be on the backyard. So let's go have a look at that. Here's the side of the house. You'll notice that there's a gas meter there. There's several air vents, and there's a couple small windows along the side of the house. The owner has planted a few trees, but there hasn't been much landscaping done. At the corner of the house, you see this downspout. Now, whenever you see water coming off the roof, you have to take note of that. Drainage is one of the big issues you have to design for. You'll notice that the back corner of the house has a basement window with a window well around it. We're going to have to take that into consideration because we don't want to block the light from getting into the basement. So we kind of have to leave this area open. We also don't want to remove that metal that's around the window. If we do that, then we might have a drainage issue with water running into the basement. So when you see something like this, it's best to just leave it alone and do a design around it. Also have a look at this big wall. This wall actually belongs to the subdivision, not to the homeowner, so we can't change that wall. Here's a view into the backyard. A few trees have been planted, but they're pretty young at this stage. Any of them could easily be removed. Here's a look at the back corner. You can now see the detail of the brick wall. It's interesting that when I give this course, most of the people in the audience hate this wall and want to get rid of it. Personally, I don't mind the wall so much, but I hate that back fence. It looks just like every other fence in the neighborhood. That's really boring. So as we go through the design process, we should think about ways of hiding either the fence or the wall, depending on the one that you like the least. There are a couple trees here. We may or may not keep those. Even though something is already there, don't let that stop you from creating a design that excludes it. Some of these things are quite easy to replace. We're now standing in the back corner looking towards the street. Here's a look at the back of the house. You can see a couple windows and a door. And the one thing you'll notice is that the door is several feet above grade. There's no way to get out of this house to go into the backyard. So clearly this is an important thing we have to solve. The back of this house also has some windows, and we need to keep that in the back of our minds. We want to create a view from inside the house that's really nice. Here's a view down that back fence. You can see several of their neighbors here. Nobody has put up a privacy fence, so it's one big field. It'd be really nice when we're finished with the design that we get some privacy to keep the neighbors out of here. You'll also notice that the neighbor has a high deck. And when they're out on that deck, they're looking down at the backyard. So whatever we do in our yard, we're going to have people looking down into it. This is our design process, and we're in step 1 of that. Create a sketch plan. A sketch plan is a very rough drawing of your garden with all the dimensions put on it. This is really just a tool that will allow us to make a better looking drawing and one that's to scale. So it's a stepping stone towards the final design. Let's make a sketch plan of this garden. Take any regular piece of paper, it doesn't matter what you're using for this, and do a rough drawing of your property. Include things like fences, trees, gardens, the house, anything that's going to be important in this space, put it on the piece of paper. Don't worry about doing it to the right scale, but try and get the location sort of correct. Step 1 is to simply draw the pieces that you have. So in my case, I have a house, and that's the most prominent part. Here it has roughly this kind of a shape. Now I'm not going to design the front of the garden. We're going to focus on the back, so I don't really have to draw anything in the front of the house. I'm only interested in this back portion. I have a brick wall over here, a fence at the back. The other thing that's important to draw on here is the property line. Even though there's no fence on this side, I still want to indicate where my property ends because I can't design past that. So the property line runs somewhere in here. Now this property has 3 trees over here. These 2 seem completely out of place, and I don't think we're going to keep those. They just seem like an odd place for anyone to plant trees, so I'm going to leave that out. If you have things like old sheds that you know you're going to take out because they're crappy looking, don't put those in on the drawing. Just draw things that you think you're going to keep. Now there's a tree in the back here. I may or may not keep it, so for now I'm going to put it in. Again, at this stage, I'm not worried about the exact location, but I want things more or less in the right place. Now let's come back to the house because there are some other things that we do want to include in this. For instance, at this corner, I have a downspout. Now that's important, not because it's going to be a big part of my design, but this is a place that water comes down. And one of the things we have to do in design is figure out what's going to happen to this water when it gushes out of here. We have to build that into our plan. There's another one over here, and a couple more at the front of the house that we can ignore. Now what about these symbols that I'm using? There are probably standard symbols for all of this, but we don't have to use them. Put something in that makes sense to you. Now at the back of this house, somewhere in the center, we have a door. And I'll just mark that door. We also have a couple windows here. Now the windows are important because when we're designing the garden, the way it looks from inside of the house is almost as important as outside of the house, particularly if you live in colder climates. You spend more time here than you will here. So this view is more important than this view. Now we don't have to worry about windows on the upper levels quite so much, but these downstairs ones are important. In here we have a kitchen nook. And so we're going to spend a lot of time here looking out this window. Now there are also a couple of small side windows. Now you can put a W there to tell you that these are windows. There's also a water tap here. The water tap is important because that's how we're going to irrigate the whole property. In the back half of this property, this is the only source of water. In here there's a window in the basement and one of these wells that goes around the windows, so we can mark that in. We're probably not going to want to move that, otherwise we won't get any light into the window, and we might even get water running in there. So that's kind of a permanent fixture. We don't really want to touch that. Out here somewhere there is a gas meter. That's important because service people have to be able to access the property and come and read this meter. So we have to be careful about what we put in front of it. The idea here is to put anything on the drawing that will help you decide what the final design is. The next step is to get some measurements in here. We can use a tape measure to measure the back width of the house, and in a few minutes I'll show you how to use that tape measure. Measure this, came out to 23 feet. So that's the width of the house. Now, how accurate do you need to make these measurements? For the kind of design we're going to do, plus and minus a foot is close enough. Now, when you actually go and do some construction here, if I'm going to put a deck at the back of the house, I'm going to want to measure this a little more accurate to make sure it fits. But for the purpose of the design process, to the closest foot is accurate enough. I also want to know how far this brick wall is from the house, and I just simply measure that along here. And that turned out to be 18 feet. I'll also want to know where these windows are and these doors and how wide those are. Turns out this door is 2.5 feet. This window is a 2-foot window. This window is 4.5 feet. Now I know how far this wall is from the house. Now I figure out how far the back fence is. The easiest way to do this is to pick one of these corners of the house. Those are your main points, and everything else is relative to that. So we can figure out this distance. We know how far back the fence is. And that worked out to 40 feet. The other distance we want to know is where does this corner line up with this wall? We know it's 18 feet this way. But what is the distance from the end of the wall to the end of the house? So that's this distance here. That worked out to 18 feet. So far we've been dealing with things that are nice and square, and that makes the measuring easier. But sometimes you have things that aren't square. So let's say that this back fence wasn't at right angles to the wall, that the back fence actually came this way. Well, what you would do is draw a line down here, and then measure from this point out to the fence, measure from this point out to the fence, and measure from this point out to the fence. If you have those three distances, you'll know exactly where to put this diagonal. For this tree, we want to know where it is also, and the easiest thing to do is just simply measure these two distances. 5 feet and 4 feet. Now there's one other thing that's important to add to this drawing. If you remember the back door, it was quite a bit above grade, and that's something we're going to have to deal with. So the height of this is important for us to know. So the elevation here was 3 feet. In our final design, we're going to have to find some way to get the person who's standing 3 feet above the grass down to the garden level. So we're almost finished. We've got the sizes and distances of everything in the garden, but there's one other thing we really should look at, and that is the slope of the whole property. Now, if you're on a very flat property, of course you can ignore this, but this property is not perfectly flat. If we have a look at this picture and look at the back fence, you'll notice that the fence seems to be pretty straight coming across. But as you get closer and closer to the corner where the wall is, you can see the top of the fence starts making little jags, and it comes lower and lower and lower. The reason for that is that there's a slope. It's higher on the right side and lower on the left side. And when the ground slopes, it's important for us to take that into consideration. Now, I'll show you how to measure slope in a few minutes. So what I found is that the slope in this part of the garden is about 2 inches per 10 feet. But once we get down to about here, it increases to 6 inches per 10 feet. There's a drop off towards the wall. And that's going to become really critical in this design. And I'll explain that in a future video. Once you've got the drawing to this stage, you're finished with your sketch plan. It's pretty rough. Don't worry about that. We don't have to worry about neatness here. What's important is that we get all the dimensions on. Let me give you a few tips to make it easier to create your sketch plan. Before you start it, see if you have a survey of your property. It'll show your property lines, the front curbs, the position of the house, and it includes a lot of the measurements. If you have that, start from there. Save you doing a lot of measuring. So what do you use to do this measuring? I mean, if you have a laser, that's great. You can use that. There are also some tape measures. This is the one I use. It's just a real cheap one from the dollar store. And there are some of these that are really long. They can do 100 feet or more. You don't need one of those for this project. Any tape measure that you have will work. This one happens to be 16 feet long, so I can't measure anything longer than that. So what do I do then? Well, that's pretty simple. Let's assume you have a tape measure and it's only 6 inches long. That's the most it will measure. But I want to measure from here all the way over to here with this dinky little thing. I just go out in the yard, measure this part, and put something here. Now that could be a stone, a piece of wood, a stick, or if you have a friend helping you, they just put their foot there. Then you measure from there to there and you do it again. And again. And again. And then you measure the last little piece. And you just add it all up. In fact, when I'm doing this, what I do is I just take this, make it 10 feet long, and I just eyeball where I'm ending. And I just stare at that spot while I move over another 10 feet. Don't go out and buy a special ruler for this project. So how do you measure slope? Well, here's a pretty simple way. You need 3 things. You need a ruler, you need a level, and you need some sort of board, preferably one that's straight. So in this picture, I have a 2x4 that's say 8 feet long. I put the level on top of it, and I take one end of the board and I lay it on the ground. Then I take the other end of the board and lift and lower it until it's level. I then measure the distance between the board and the ground. So let's say the measured distance is 3 inches and my board is 8 feet long. I now know that the slope is 3 inches every 8 feet. Then I take this board and move it along 8 feet. So I put the one end where the ruler is and move the ruler down to the other end of the board. And I can work my way along a lawn and measure the slope every 8 feet. And this is accurate enough for the kind of work we're going to do. There's another way that you can measure slope if you have a fence going across the property. So this is the view, the back corner of the property. If you have a look at the top of the fence going from right to left, you'll see that it jogs down a bit. And then you go across and it jogs down a bit. The reason for that is the fact that the ground slopes here. And in fact, towards the left corner, there's a bit of a swale. There's a low spot there. And that was put in on purpose. All the water runs down to this spot, and then it runs along the brick wall to the street. And that's how the water leaves the property. So the slope in this area is pretty important. If I want to know what the slope is, I can just measure the drop in the top of the fence posts here. Fence posts are 8 feet apart, and the drop between each one looks like it's 3 inches, 4 inches, something like that. So if I have a fence going in the right direction, I can get slope that way. But the previous way I showed you to get slope, that works anywhere in your property in whatever direction you want. It is important to measure the slope. Humans are extremely bad at looking at a piece of property and seeing the slope. Our minds are designed to make everything horizontal, and so our minds correct the slope that's there. So don't trust yourself. What if you have a curve on the property? How do you measure that? Let's say this is the back fence, and in front of that we have a flower bed. The flower bed goes something like this. How are you going to measure that? Pick a point along here, like this corner, and measure out to here. Then go over a little bit, maybe 3 feet, maybe 5 feet. The smaller the curve, the more measurements you have to take. So go over a little bit and measure this. Repeat that process. You need the distance from there to there as well as the distance from here to here. With those two numbers, you can find this point precisely. Once you have these points, you can guess at the in-between line here. And that'll be close enough for this purpose. Here's your homework assignment. Prepare a sketch plan for the property you're working on. Keep working on that picture file. Keep collecting pictures of gardens and things in gardens that you like. And then watch the next video in the playlist called Garden Design Secrets. And I'll put a link to that playlist in the top right-hand corner. Have fun making your sketch plan.